The air was eerily still in the small town of Chaplin. A dense, overcast sky loomed overhead, casting a gray shadow over the quiet suburban streets. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel natural, an absence of movement, an unsettling calm. Heather Messenger had always been a familiar face in the neighborhood. She was the kind of woman who took morning walks with her young son, exchanged polite conversations with neighbors, and kept her home well maintained. But today, something was off. Her front yard, usually pristine, was eerily undisturbed. Her car sat in the driveway, untouched, yet no one had seen her leave the house. By late afternoon, concern turned into suspicion. A close friend, who had been trying to reach Heather all day, found it increasingly unusual that she wasn't answering her phone. Calls went straight to voicemail. There were no signs of activity in the house, no lights flicking on, no sounds of movement from within. And then there was the most unsettling detail. David Messenger, her husband, had been seen outside earlier that morning, but his demeanor had been strange. He was distant, unfocused, and he seemed to avoid eye contact with anyone who passed by. By early evening, a concerned neighbor finally decided to act. She made her way up to the Messenger residence and knocked on the door. The knock echoed against the hollow silence of the house. No answer. She knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. Something wasn't right. The neighbor hesitated before reaching for her phone. Calling 911 felt like an extreme measure, but the growing sense of unease gnawed at her. When the dispatcher answered, she explained the situation. A woman had seemingly disappeared, her car was still in the driveway, and her husband was acting strangely. Within minutes, a patrol car was dispatched to the scene. When officers arrived, they approached the home with measured caution. The house itself was undisturbed. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. A knock on the door yielded no response. But then, just as they prepared to circle around the house, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was David Messenger. His appearance was disheveled, his hair unkempt, his clothes slightly rumpled. But what stood out the most was his expression. There was something vacant in his eyes, an absence that sent a cold shiver down the spine of one of the officers. His face was blank, unreadable, but there was an uneasiness about him. "Sir, we received a call about your wife. Is she home?" one officer asked. David's response was slow. He blinked, his lips parting slightly as if he had just realized he was being spoken to. "Heather?" he muttered. His voice was hollow. "She's not here." The officers exchanged glances. His answer wasn't inherently suspicious, but something about his tone was unsettling. "May we come in?" There was a pause, a flicker of something in David's expression. Hesitation, uncertainty, something else. And then finally he stepped aside. The officers entered cautiously. The house was strangely silent. There were no signs of a struggle, no immediate red flags. But as they moved deeper into the home, something felt wrong. One of the officers noted the slight disarray in the living room. A blanket crumpled on the floor, a coffee table with an overturned book. Small details that seemed insignificant on their own, but together painted a picture of something unfinished, interrupted. Then they saw it, a small dark stain on the hardwood floor. It was just a few inches wide, barely noticeable. But the moment one of the officers spotted it, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The stain was a deep reddish brown, dried at the edges. Blood. The tension in the room thickened. One officer moved toward the stain, while the other subtly placed a hand near his radio, ready to call for backup. "David, where's your wife?" David's breathing had changed. It was subtle but noticeable, slightly uneven, as if he had suddenly become aware of something he hadn't considered before. Then, in an almost mechanical motion, he lifted his hands. The officer's eyes darted down. There was dried blood on his knuckles. Everything happened in a blur. An officer stepped forward, instinctively placing a hand on David's arm, while the other called in for immediate assistance. "Sir, we need you to step outside with us." David didn't resist, but there was something eerie about the way he moved, almost as if he were sleepwalking, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. The search of the house intensified. Within minutes, they found what they had been dreading. In the corner of a dimly lit room, Partially obscured by a toppled chair, lay the body of Heather Messenger. Her lifeless form was still. The scene was brutal, yet eerily silent. No sounds, no final words left behind. Just the cold reality of what had transpired. The officers stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the discovery. The small-town quiet that had felt so unsettling earlier in the day had now turned suffocating. David Messenger stood outside, his breath visible in the cold air, as backup arrived and he was placed in handcuffs. But his face remained unreadable, as if he himself did not fully understand what had just happened. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks of color across the darkened street as more officers arrived at the scene. The usual quiet of the neighborhood was now broken by the crackling of police radios, hurried footsteps, and the murmurs of onlookers gathering at a safe distance. What had started as a welfare check had rapidly escalated into something much more sinister. Inside the house, the air was thick, stale, suffocating. Officers moved with measured caution, their boots pressing into the wooden floor, creaking under the weight of something far heavier than just their bodies. The discovery of Heather Messenger's body had shifted the night into something irreversibly grim. The dim lighting in the room cast elongated shadows over the space, giving the crime scene an even more eerie appearance. Heather lay motionless, her body positioned in a way that suggested no natural fall. There was nothing peaceful about it. Her form was twisted slightly, arms at odd angles, and her hair, once neatly kept, was matted against her face. But it was the injuries that sent a collective chill through the responding officers. There was no mistaking the violence. Blood had splattered onto the nearby wall, some of it dried, indicating that the attack hadn't just happened within the last few minutes. It had been hours, maybe longer. There was a pool of blood beneath her, a deep crimson against the polished wood, darkened at the edges where it had begun to congeal. The weapon was close by, a wooden stick, possibly from a broken piece of furniture, coated with smears of red. A fireplace poker lay discarded a few feet away, its metallic surface dulled with what looked like dried blood. One of the officers took a slow breath, steadying himself before turning to another. "We need the forensics team in here now." The next few moments were a blur of procedure. The scene was cordoned off, evidence markers were placed, and cameras flashed, documenting the grim tableau. Every detail had to be preserved, every potential clue recorded, before the forensic team could analyze what had happened. Outside, David Messenger stood in the cold, his hands restrained, his face still eerily vacant. He had not asked any questions. He had not protested his detainment. He had not even inquired about his wife. A detective arrived, stepping past the crowd, taking in the scene with a grim expression. He was no stranger to cases like this, yet every new crime scene carried the same weight, a heaviness that settled into the chest like a dull ache. He had been briefed on the situation: concerned neighbors, an unresponsive husband, and a woman found dead under violent circumstances. Stepping into the house, the detective felt the weight of the moment. The details already painted a disturbing picture. But he knew that first impressions were often misleading. He scanned the living room first. The house was not ransacked. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no broken locks. The television remote still rested neatly on the arm of the couch. A half-filled coffee cup sat abandoned on the dining table, a thin layer of cold liquid inside. It suggested that whatever had happened, it had been sudden. Moving toward the victim's body, he crouched, observing the angles of impact. Heather had been struck multiple times, not just once, not just a desperate act in the heat of an argument. This was something else, something more deliberate. He looked toward the blood-spattered walls. The patterns suggested force, uncontrolled, erratic, fueled by something beyond mere impulse. The crime scene itself told a story, and the detective had seen enough to know that this was not a simple act of self-defense. A forensic expert knelt beside him, adjusting his gloves before carefully inspecting the wound patterns. "Multiple impacts," he muttered, confirming the detective's unspoken thoughts. "Not a single fatal strike. Repeated blows. Overkill. Overkill." The word hung in the air, thick with implication. Crimes of overkill often suggested deep personal rage. This wasn't an intruder caught off guard. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. The detective glanced toward the doorway, where David Messenger stood under the watch of two officers. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't struggling, wasn't reacting, not even in fear, just blank. But what unsettled the detective the most wasn't David's lack of reaction. It was the blood on his hands, the dried smudges on his sleeves, the faint streak along his jaw, as if he had wiped it absent-mindedly. There were no fresh injuries on him, no defensive wounds. He did not appear harmed in any way. Yet the blood was there. The forensic team continued their work, collecting samples, marking positions, photographing every inch of the scene. The detective knew the next few hours would be critical. They needed to establish a timeline, secure testimonies, understand what had led to this moment. But one question loomed over all the evidence, over all the blood and silence. Where had David been all this time? Inside the dimly lit police station, the weight of the unfolding tragedy pressed against the walls, thick and suffocating. The sound of boots echoing against the tiled floors was the only noise breaking the oppressive silence as officers moved with calculated purpose. The crime scene had been locked down, the forensic team was still collecting samples, and the investigators were sifting through the details. But the most immediate priority had been clear from the moment the body was found. David Messenger needed to be questioned. He sat motionless in the interrogation room, his hands resting on the metal table, fingers slightly curled, as if they had been frozen mid-motion. His clothes remained stained, dark streaks of dried blood trailing along his sleeves, smudges on his hands, some even on his face. Yet he hadn't once asked for a tissue, hadn't requested to wash up. It was as if he was completely unaware of the mess that clung to him. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that sharpened the angles of his face. His expression was blank, his eyes unfocused, staring at nothing in particular. He hadn't spoken much since being brought in, only muttering Heather's name once under his breath when they'd first escorted him into the squad car. That had been hours ago. Since then, silence. Detective Mark Reynolds, a seasoned investigator who had seen his fair share of violent crime, watched from behind the one-way mirror, arms crossed over his chest. There was something deeply unsettling about the man in the interrogation room. He had interviewed suspects who sobbed, pleaded, denied, screamed in anger, reactions that made sense in the face of a tragedy. But David, he was neither frantic nor calculating. He was something else entirely. Reynolds exhaled slowly, pushing the door open, the metal handle cool beneath his fingers. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet but deliberate click. The air in the room was stale, thick with the scent of sweat and something faintly metallic, perhaps the lingering odor of blood. David barely reacted. Reynolds pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing a notepad on the table, but not opening it yet. He didn't start with questions, not immediately. He simply observed, giving the moment space to breathe. Sometimes silence was more revealing than words. David blinked slowly, his gaze drifting toward Reynolds as if only just realizing someone else was in the room. "You've been sitting here for a while," Reynolds finally said, his voice measured, steady. "You haven't asked about your wife. You haven't asked why you're here." David's lips parted slightly. There was a long pause before he finally spoke, his voice dry, hoarse. "Heather," Reynolds nodded. "Yes, your wife." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the edge of the table. "Tell me what happened tonight, David." David blinked again. His mouth opened, then closed. His jaw tensed. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Hesitation? Fear? "I don't—" His voice trailed off. "I don't know." Reynolds studied him carefully. It wasn't uncommon for people in shock to struggle with memory recall, but there was something about the way David said it that didn't sit right. "You don't know what happened to your wife?" David exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching slightly against the cold surface of the table. His gaze dropped to his own hands as if noticing the dried blood for the first time. His breathing hitched, barely, but enough for Reynolds to notice. "You were in the house," Reynolds continued, his voice unwavering. "You opened the door for officers. You were covered in blood. And now you're telling me you don't know what happened?" David inhaled sharply, his shoulders stiffening. I don't remember, he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Reynolds let that sit for a moment before he leaned back slightly. All right, then let's talk about what you do remember. Start with this morning. David's brows furrowed slightly, as if he was trying to grasp onto something just out of reach. He licked his lips, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. I woke up late, he murmured. Heather was already awake. She was in the kitchen, making breakfast for our son. Reynolds took a mental note. The child. A boy. He'd be another piece of this puzzle. David continued, his words slow, deliberate, like each one required effort. I remember sitting at the table. She put coffee in front of me. His gaze lifted, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. A sliver of something, an emotion he hadn't shown yet. She was quiet. Quiet how? David swallowed. Like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Reynolds nodded. Did anything seem off? David hesitated, his hands pressing flat against the table. She was distant. I asked if something was wrong. She said she was fine. Reynolds watched him carefully, noting the slight tremor in his fingers. Did you two argue? David's lips pressed together, and for the briefest second, his gaze flickered to the one-way mirror. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough that Reynolds caught it. I don't remember, David muttered. The detective sat in silence for a few beats, letting the weight of those words settle between them. Then slowly he leaned forward again. David, Reynolds said, voice lower now, steady but firm. Your wife is dead. A sharp inhale, a shift of the shoulders, but still no outburst, no cry of denial or grief. We found her inside the house, Reynolds continued. She suffered multiple blows to the head. She bled out on your floor, and you were there. David's breathing became shallow. His fingers curled slightly against the table. So I need you to think very carefully, Reynolds pressed, because right now, you're the only one who can tell us what happened. David's eyes flickered, something dark shifting behind them. His lips parted, his breathing uneven now. For a moment, Reynolds thought he was finally about to break. Then David whispered something, a single, trembling word. They. Reynolds frowned. They! David's hands clenched into fists, his whole body tensed, his gaze darting around the room, like he was suddenly aware of something unseen. They, he repeated, voice hoarse. His breathing hitched. They were watching. They were there. Reynolds felt the first prickle of unease crawl down his spine. Who? He pressed. Who was there? David's breathing quickened, his posture rigid now. They, he whispered again, more frantic this time. I told her we weren't safe. His eyes locked onto Reynolds, wide and unblinking, and for the first time that night, his expression was no longer vacant. It was fear. The walls of the interrogation room felt closer now, the silence thick, pressing against every inch of space. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting harsh white reflections onto the metal table. The air carried the faint metallic tang of dried blood and sweat. David Messenger sat rigid, his shoulders hunched, his hands flat on the table. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked about his wife. He hadn't asked about his son. Detective Mark Reynolds sat across from him, his fingers tapping lightly against the notepad in front of him, watching every twitch, every shallow breath. David had barely spoken since they brought him in. The only thing he had muttered, the only hint of emotion, was that one word. They. The detective had been in law enforcement long enough to know that people break in different ways. Some lash out, desperate to deny. Others cry, overwhelmed by guilt. And then there were the ones who retreated inside themselves, who sat with their hands folded neatly on the table, staring at something that wasn't there. David's eyes weren't vacant. They were searching, watching something just beyond the walls, something no one else could see. Reynolds leaned forward slightly, careful not to break the silence too soon. He let the tension grow, let the weight of it press down, let the sheer emptiness of the moment make David feel the need to fill it. They were watching, David whispered. His voice cracked at the edges, raw and hollow. His hands twitched slightly, fingers curling against the cool metal surface. I told her. I told Heather we weren't safe. The detective made a slow note. The words felt rehearsed, not in a calculated way, but like something that had been said over and over again in his own mind. A delusion fed by time, by isolation, by paranoia. Who? Reynolds asked, voice steady. Who was watching? David inhaled sharply through his nose, his shoulders tensing. His gaze flickered, just a flicker, to the one-way mirror behind the detective. Everywhere, he whispered. They're everywhere. Reynolds studied him, watching the tremor in his hands, the uneven rise and fall of his chest. His words weren't those of a man with a clear head. They were fragments, disjointed, broken thoughts slipping through cracks in his mind. But that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. The detective tapped his pen against the notepad, shifting gears. Tell me about today. Tell me about this morning. David blinked. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't answer right away. His breathing slowed, as if trying to steady something unraveling inside him. I woke up late, he murmured. His voice was dull, like the words were being pulled from somewhere deep, somewhere he didn't want to go. Heather was already up. She was in the kitchen, making breakfast for our son. A pause, his fingers curled tighter. She wasn't talking much, just moving around, like she was thinking about something. Reynolds tilted his head slightly. Did she seem upset? David swallowed, a slow, deliberate motion. I don't know. His lips pressed together. She looked distant. The detective scribbled another note. Did you two argue? David hesitated, a beat too long. His breathing was shallow again. No. The lie was almost too obvious. Reynolds let it slide, for now. Did she say anything unusual? David's gaze flickered downward, staring at his own hands, still stained with the remnants of dried blood. His lips trembled. She said everything was going to be okay. The words sent a chill down Reynolds' spine. Heather had said everything was going to be okay. That meant she had been afraid. The detective leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. David, why did she say that? A tremor ran through the man's hands. His breathing hitched. He looked up suddenly, his eyes wide, his pupils dark and unfocused. I don't know, he rasped. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Reynolds held his gaze for a moment before pushing back in his chair. He exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. He had seen enough cases to know when a suspect was lying. David Messenger wasn't just lying, he was falling apart. And somewhere in the middle of that collapse was the truth. While the interrogation continued, the forensic team was still combing through the house. Every inch of the living room was carefully documented, from the impact splatter on the walls to the pooling blood drying into the wooden floor. The evidence markers created a grim constellation of violence. The pathologist, Dr. Elaine Carter, examined the blood patterns closely. The scene spoke volumes. The first strike had been enough to wound, but not to kill. There had been movement. The second and third had landed harder. But then came more. Too many to count. This hadn't been a controlled act of anger. This had been something else. Overkill. And then there was the suitcase, found in the closet, partially packed. Neatly folded clothes, a pair of shoes, a toiletry bag. It wasn't haphazard, wasn't rushed. It had been planned. Dr. Carter frowned. If Heather had been getting ready to leave, had she told anyone? Had she mentioned it to her friends, to family? Or had she kept it to herself? Had David known? Had he found out? Detective Reynolds was still watching David when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the message from the crime scene team. His stomach tightened as he read the words. Heather was packing. He looked back at David, whose gaze remained locked onto the table. The way his hands trembled slightly, the way his breathing hitched every few moments. Had Heather tried to leave? Had she told him? Had that been the breaking point? Reynolds let the silence settle again before leaning forward. David, he said quietly, your wife was packing a bag. David's entire body stiffened. She was getting ready to leave, Reynolds continued. Did you know that? For a long moment, David didn't move. Then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, no. A lie. Reynolds didn't push yet. Instead, he let the silence settle. The room was heavy with it, pressing down like an unseen force. Then, almost too softly to hear, David whispered, she shouldn't have left. Reynolds felt something cold settle in his gut, because in that moment, for the first time, David Messenger wasn't talking about them anymore. He was talking about her, and that changed everything. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to absorb the tension, trapping the weight of everything unsaid between its cold, lifeless surfaces. The air was thick, carrying the faint scent of sweat and something metallic, perhaps a lingering trace of the blood that had dried on David Messenger's hands. He hadn't moved much since he had been brought in, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Detective Mark Reynolds watched him from across the table, his fingers loosely wrapped around a pen, tapping it against his notepad in slow, rhythmic beats. Every so often he would pause, giving David the space to speak, but the silence stretched longer each time. The words David had whispered in their last exchange still hung in the air. She shouldn't have left. Reynolds had heard many confessions before. Some were blunt, immediate admissions of guilt. Others were wrapped in layers of justification, the accused trying to convince themselves that their actions had been necessary. But then there were confessions like this, half-formed, muttered under breath, not necessarily an admission of guilt, but an unraveling of thought, a moment where the truth threatened to break through whatever mental defenses had been built around it. He exhaled slowly, flipping to a fresh page in his notepad. "David," he said evenly, "I want to go over the timeline again." David blinked. It was a slow, deliberate movement, his eyes shifting toward the detective as if only now registering his presence. His fingers twitched against the cool surface of the table. "You woke up late that morning," Reynolds continued, keeping his tone measured. "Heather was in the kitchen. She seemed distant. She told you everything was going to be okay, but you don't remember arguing." David didn't respond. His breathing had changed slightly, but his lips remained pressed together. Reynolds studied him for a long moment before pressing on. "Then what happened next?" David's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He seemed to consider the question, or perhaps he was searching for the right answer, one that fit within whatever fractured reality he had constructed in his own mind. "I don't remember," he murmured. A lie. Reynolds could feel it in the way David's shoulders stiffened, in the way his hands flexed slightly as if resisting the urge to clench into fists. "David," Reynolds said, his voice unwavering, "you were there. You were in that house. You were covered in your wife's blood. You told me she shouldn't have left, so I'm going to ask you again. What happened after breakfast?" David exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching again. "I don't remember," he repeated, but this time his voice had changed, thinner, almost fragile, like a rope pulled too tight. Reynolds studied him. He was breaking, but not all at once. This wasn't a man who would shatter under pressure. This was a man who was crumbling, piece by piece, his mind struggling to hold on to something that no longer made sense. Back at the crime scene, the forensic team worked tirelessly, combing through every inch of the house for anything that could provide clarity to the timeline. The living room was still a grotesque canvas of violence. Dried blood spattered against the walls, the furniture bearing the marks of a struggle that had been both desperate and one-sided. But it was the details outside the immediate crime scene that painted an even more troubling picture. Heather's packed suitcase had been discovered in the closet, a silent testament to something that had been set in motion before her death. It hadn't been fully packed, but it had been deliberate. Clothing folded neatly, shoes carefully placed inside, toiletries organized as if she had intended to leave soon. Had she been planning to escape? Had she known something no one else did? One of the forensic techs moved toward a small desk in the corner of the bedroom, pulling open drawers carefully. Inside, everything seemed organized, untouched. But then, tucked between a few envelopes and receipts, something caught his eye. A letter. It was partially crumpled, as if it had been folded and unfolded multiple times. The ink was slightly smudged in places, the pressure of the pen uneven, signs of a hand that had been shaking while writing. The tech carefully unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. "I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I can't live like this. If something happens to me, please make sure my son is safe." The words sent a ripple through the room. The implication was chilling. Heather had been afraid, not just uncomfortable, Not just unhappy, afraid. Had she tried to leave before? Had David caught her? Had there been other incidents, ones that never made it onto police reports, ones that only the walls of this house had witnessed? The discovery of the letter was relayed back to the station within minutes. Reynolds listened in silence as the forensic team read it to him over the phone. His grip on the receiver tightened. "Bag it," he instructed. "Get prints, handwriting analysis, everything." He ended the call and turned back to David, who had remained motionless, his eyes still cast downward. "She was leaving you," Reynolds said flatly. "Did you know that?" David's entire body tensed. "We found the suitcase," Reynolds continued. "We found her letter." He let the silence hang between them for a moment, let the weight of the revelation settle. "She was afraid of you, David." For the first time, David moved. His head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Reynolds. The expression that crossed his face was something between confusion and fury, but there was something else beneath it. Panic. "That's not true," David whispered. Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "Then explain it to me." David's breathing had turned shallow again, his hands flexing against the table. His pupils were blown wide, his skin suddenly a shade paler, the signs of a man cornered. "I loved my wife," he muttered. Reynolds nodded slowly, watching him. "Then why was she packing a bag?" David inhaled sharply, his shoulders lifting as if he were bracing against some invisible weight. "You don't understand," he said suddenly, his voice more urgent now. "She didn't need to leave. I told her—" He cut himself off. Reynolds' stomach clenched. "Told her what, David?" David's eyes darted toward the mirror again, that same flicker of paranoia returning. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Reynolds leaned in, voice low, steady. "What did you tell her?" David's breath hitched. His fingers curled against the table. His pulse was visible at his throat, beating rapidly beneath the skin. Then in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, that she was safer here, that they wouldn't find her if she stayed. A cold chill ran down Reynolds' spine. David's delusions were bleeding into reality, distorting everything. The detective exhaled slowly. Who wouldn't find her? David blinked, and for the first time since the interrogation began, his expression changed. The blankness was gone, the detachment shattered. His face twisted into something raw, something broken. His hands clenched into fists. His breath shuddered. And then, his voice cracking under its own weight, he whispered, "Me." The early morning chill settled heavily over the police station, clinging to the walls and creeping into the bones of the officers who had spent the last several hours piecing together the grim reality of what had happened inside the Messenger household. The station was alive with quiet urgency. Detectives murmured in low voices. Forensics analysts shuffled between rooms with files and reports. And somewhere down the hall, the faint hum of a vending machine filled the silence left between conversations about blood spatter patterns and psychological evaluations. Inside the interrogation room, David Messenger remained in the same chair he had occupied for hours, his posture stiff, his hands still resting on the cold metal table. The blood that had once stained his fingers had long since dried, leaving behind dark, cracked remnants clinging to his skin like an echo of what had been done. He had barely spoken since his last whispered confession, his breathing shallow, his gaze fixed on something beyond the sterile walls. Detective Mark Reynolds leaned against the doorframe outside the room, rubbing a hand over his face as he processed everything they had uncovered in the last few hours. The forensic reports were damning, the psychological profile was disturbing, and the child's testimony, the small, hesitant words of a 5-year-old who had heard his mother cry moments before she was silenced forever, was perhaps the most chilling piece of all. Reynolds had handled his fair share of violent crimes, but there was something different about this case, something unsettling in the way David's mind seemed to fracture and reassemble itself, in the way his words felt both deliberate and lost at the same time. It was the kind of instability that made it impossible to predict what he would say or do next. Steeling himself, Reynolds pushed off the doorframe and stepped into the room, the sound of his boots against the linoleum breaking the heavy silence. David didn't look up. Reynolds sat down across from him, opening his notepad but not writing anything down just yet. He let the silence stretch between them, testing to see if David would fill it on his own. Minutes passed. Nothing. Reynolds sighed, flipping to the forensic report. He traced his fingers over the printed words, absorbing the details once again before speaking. "We got the autopsy report," he said, his voice even, careful. "Your wife suffered multiple blunt force injuries. Some were delivered with enough force to fracture bone." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "Do you understand what that means, David?" David didn't react. Reynolds pressed on. "It means whoever did this wasn't just trying to hurt her. They weren't just trying to make her stop talking, stop moving. They were trying to erase her." David's fingers twitched. A small movement, but noticeable. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "And the thing about rage," he continued, "is that it's not random. It's personal. People kill in self-defense, in fear, out of necessity. But when someone keeps hitting after the victim is already down, that's different. That's not just killing. That's destruction." For the first time in hours, David shifted. His shoulders tightened, his breath quickening just slightly. His eyes flickered toward the detective, the first real acknowledgement of his presence in what felt like forever. Reynolds didn't let up. "We also found the letter," he said. "The one Heather wrote." He watched David carefully, searching for a reaction. "She was afraid of you, David. She said if something happened to her, she wanted to make sure your son was safe." David inhaled sharply. His fingers curled against the table, the nails pressing into the metal. "You told me she was safer here," Reynolds said, "that they wouldn't find her if she stayed. But you weren't talking about them, were you?" He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "You were talking about yourself." A muscle in David's jaw twitched. His breath was coming quicker now, his body rigid, as if bracing against something unseen. Reynolds exhaled slowly, pulling out another file and flipping it open. "You've been diagnosed before, haven't you?" David didn't answer, but the silence itself was an answer. Reynolds continued. "Delusional disorder, persecutory type, paranoia, persistent belief that you were being watched, followed, that people were conspiring against you. It's all here, in your medical records." He let the paper fall onto the table with a quiet rustle. "How long had it been since you took your medication, David?" A tremor ran through David's hands. "How long?" Reynolds repeated, his voice lower now, edged with something sharper. David finally looked up, and for the first time, his expression cracked. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated. There was something behind them now, something raw, something unraveling. "I didn't need it," he whispered. Reynolds leaned back slightly. "That's not what Heather thought." David flinched. It was subtle, but it was there. Reynolds studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "David," he said carefully, "what did Heather say to you that night?" David's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His breathing was shallow, rapid. His hands curled into fists. Reynolds pressed. "Did she tell you she was leaving?" A tremor ran through David's shoulders. His lips parted, and this time, words tumbled out, raw and fractured. "She said I was sick," he whispered. "She said I needed help. She didn't understand. She didn't—" His breath hitched, his fingers flexing against the table. "I told her I was protecting us. I told her—" He cut himself off, his whole body going rigid. Reynolds could see it now. The moment of realization. The moment David's mind tried to hold on to something that was already slipping through his grasp. "You told her what, David?" Reynolds pushed, his voice sharper now. David's breath was shaking. His hands were trembling. And then, his gaze locked onto Reynolds, something dark and broken flashing behind his eyes. "I told her she wasn't leaving," he whispered. The room went silent. Reynolds felt the weight of those words settle into his chest, heavy and suffocating. There it was. Not an outright confession. Not yet, but enough. Enough to know how this had started. Heather had tried to leave. David had stopped her, and somewhere in the struggle between those two things, she had ended up dead. Reynolds exhaled slowly, closing his notepad. He knew what came next. There were still gaps to fill, still pieces to put together, but he had enough to move forward. He stood, sliding his chair back. "David," he said quietly, "I think you need to start telling the truth." David didn't look at him, but his hands still clenched into fists on the table. were trembling. And that was enough. The air in the interrogation room was suffocating now. The weight of the truth, the inevitability of what was coming, had settled in like a thick fog. The cold metal table, the dim flicker of the fluorescent light above, the distant hum of police radios beyond the walls. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the man sitting across from Detective Mark Reynolds. David Messenger's hands were still shaking. Not violently, not enough for an untrained eye to notice, but enough. Enough for Reynolds to see the cracks spreading through whatever fractured reality David had built for himself. Enough to know that he was on the edge. For hours, David had resisted. He had danced around the truth, twisted it, fragmented it, buried it beneath paranoia and silence. But Reynolds had been here before. He knew the signs. He knew that some suspects cracked like shattering glass, and others eroded like stone. Slow, painful, inevitable. David was eroding. Reynolds leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was quiet but firm. "David," he said, "you told Heather she wasn't leaving. What happened after that?" David's breath hitched. His fingers twitched against the table. His eyes flickered, once, twice, to the one-way mirror, as if expecting to see someone on the other side. Reynolds waited. The silence stretched. The tension thickened. And then David exhaled, a long, trembling breath. His shoulders sagged, his posture collapsing inward, like a house caving in on itself. His lips parted. "Heather was scared," he whispered. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. David's voice was hoarse, barely above a breath. "She was packing her bag. I saw her. I asked her where she was going." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "She didn't answer me." Reynolds nodded slowly, encouraging him to keep going. "I told her she didn't have to leave," David continued, his voice cracking, "that we could fix things, that it wasn't safe out there, that she was safer with me." Reynolds didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt now. David's breathing grew shallower. "She told me that I needed help, that she couldn't do this anymore, that she had to think about our son." His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. "She said she was taking him with her." The detective remained still, absorbing every word. David let out a shaky exhale, his eyes darting toward the table as if trying to look away from his own memory. "I told her no. I told her we could work it out." His fingers curled tighter. She wasn't listening. The confession was forming. It was building. She kept packing. His voice was shaking now. She kept saying she was leaving. Reynolds' grip on his pen tightened. David's lips trembled. I grabbed her wrist. He closed his eyes for a brief second, but his hands were still moving, clenching, unclenching, like he could still feel the moment slipping through his fingers. I told her to stop. She pulled away. He sucked in a sharp breath, his voice lower, rawer. She shoved me. Reynolds barely blinked. David's hands were gripping the edge of the table now, his body stiff, every muscle tensed. I don't even remember reaching for it, he whispered. The poker. It was just there. The air in the room shifted. David's next breath was ragged, his voice barely holding together. I didn't mean to. He cut himself off. The words choked in his throat. His fingers twitched violently now. I hit her. Reynolds stayed perfectly still. David swallowed, his pupils dilating, his face growing paler. She fell. His breathing hitched. She looked up at me. And then she said his name. Reynolds frowned slightly. Your son? David nodded, blinking rapidly as if trying to erase the image in his mind. She wasn't talking to me anymore, he whispered. She was thinking about him, not me, not... His voice broke. The seconds stretched, the only sound in the room his uneven breathing. Reynolds exhaled slowly. You hit her again. David's shoulders jolted, like the words had physically struck him. His eyes snapped up to Reynolds, wild, hollow. I had to, he whispered. His breath was coming faster now, his fingers digging into the metal table. I had to. Reynolds held his gaze, unwavering. Had to do what, David? David's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His throat bobbed. His entire body shook. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said it. Make sure she didn't leave. The final piece. The moment stretched, heavy, inevitable, final. Reynolds inhaled through his nose, letting the silence settle before he spoke. And after that, David's gaze drifted, his breathing slowing. His hands released their grip on the table. He looked emptied, like whatever had been holding him together had finally snapped. I sat there, he murmured, for a long time. I don't know how long. His voice was distant now, detached. And then I cleaned my hands. His fingers flexed slightly. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to tell him. Reynolds' chest tightened. The child. The little boy who had heard it all, but never seen it. David exhaled one last shaky breath. I just told him everything was fine. Reynolds felt his stomach twist. David Messenger wasn't a man who had planned this. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously plotted his wife's death. But he was a man who had refused to accept the truth, that Heather Messenger had chosen to leave him, that her life had extended beyond his control, that she had made a decision that he could not allow. And in that moment, when he realized she had truly left him, his mind had done what it always did. It broke. Reynolds took a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. He let the moment sit, let David hear the echo of his own words. He didn't push any further. There was no need. They had everything they needed. Outside, through the one-way mirror, the red recording light flickered. Every word had been documented. The case, at long last, was solved. David Messenger sat across from him, his breathing slow, his body limp, his expression unreadable. And for the first time, Reynolds realized that David wasn't afraid of being arrested. He was afraid of being alone, because now there was no one left to protect him from the thing he feared most, himself. The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet shuffling of papers and the occasional murmur from the gallery. The weight of the case hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone present. This was more than just a trial. It was the final reckoning for what had happened that night in the Messenger household. David Messenger sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, his expression vacant. He no longer looked like the man who had walked freely through his neighborhood just weeks ago. The hollow emptiness in his eyes was different now, not the confusion of a fractured mind, but the quiet realization of a life that could never be undone. The prosecution had laid out the case with meticulous precision. The brutality of the attack, the forensic evidence, the witness testimony from neighbors who had sensed something was wrong in the days leading up to the murder. The handwritten letter from Heather, found hidden away, her final plea for safety. The suitcase, half-packed, a silent testament to the escape she never got to make. And then there was the confession. I killed her. The defense had built its case around David's mental state, arguing that his long history of delusional disorder had left him incapable of fully comprehending his actions. The man who had committed this crime, they claimed, had not been fully in control of his mind. They painted a picture of a husband spiraling deeper into paranoia, convinced that he was protecting his family from invisible threats, until reality had collapsed around him. But the prosecution had countered with one unshakable fact. David Messenger had known what he was doing. He had refused treatment for his condition. He had tried to prevent Heather from leaving. And when she had finally tried to take back control of her own life, he had stopped her. Now all that remained was the verdict. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady and solemn. Would the jury please stand? A ripple of tension moved through the room as 12 men and women slowly rose from their seats. David's attorney sat still, hands clasped together on the table. The lead prosecutor didn't move, eyes fixed forward. The only sound was the faint creak of the wooden benches as spectators leaned forward, holding their breath. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged man with graying hair, unfolded a small slip of paper. His voice was even, carefully measured. In the case of the state versus David Messenger on the charge of murder in the second degree, we find the defendant, a pause, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, a quiet, broken sob from Heather's family seated in the front row. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, nodding once, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for too long. David Messenger didn't move. He didn't react at all. The judge's gavel struck wood, calling for order. The sentencing would come next, but the verdict was clear. David Messenger would spend the rest of his life in custody. There was no dramatic outburst, no last-minute plea for mercy, just the dull, crushing finality of justice being served. Weeks passed. The world moved on, as it always does. The headlines slowly faded from the front pages. Other crimes took their place. But for those who had been touched by this case, the impact would never fade. Heather's family fought for change, pushing for reforms in how domestic violence cases were handled, how mental illness was monitored, how warning signs were never ignored again. Her 5-year-old son was placed into the custody of relatives, shielded from the storm that had consumed his parents' lives. He would grow up with questions that would never have answers. He would hear stories of his mother, who she was, how much she had loved him, how she had tried to protect him until the very end. And David Messenger? He was sent to a psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison, his deteriorating mental state deemed too severe for standard incarceration. He would spend the rest of his days in a locked ward, his world shrinking to the size of a sterile white room. Perhaps in the quiet of his confinement, he would finally understand the full weight of what he had done. Or perhaps he would remain lost in the delusions that had led him here in the first place. This case was not just a story of violence. It was a story of warning signs ignored, of a system that too often failed to intervene until it was too late. Heather had been afraid. She had written it down. She had packed a bag. She had tried to escape. But fear wasn't enough to protect her. The case of David and Heather Messenger was not unique. It was a pattern that played out in homes across the country, in stories that never made the headlines, in whispers between friends who suspected something was wrong but didn't know how to help. It was a story of mental illness unchecked, of a man who refused help and a woman who paid the ultimate price for it. And it was a story of justice delayed, where only in death did the truth come fully to light. In the end, the lesson was simple. When someone says they are afraid, believe them. When someone reaches out for help, listen. Because sometimes a packed suitcase is more than just luggage. Sometimes it's a last chance to escape. And sometimes that chance comes too late. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.